are distinguished academics, as I think you know, both having named chairs at MIT, which is about as good as you can do. The reason I think you're all here and this book is going to do well is because it reflects their unique ability to be deeply analytical, but bring it across to the public, to be quite top-down in vision, but have very specific recommendations, and their ability to really grab onto what's the key issue. As many of you know, Jonathan Gruber is the director of the healthcare program at National Bureau of Economic Research and president of the American Society of Health Economists. And his contributions there in practice and in writing have been enormous. But he also has done a number of other things as one of the leading figures in applied public economics. His textbook is dominant in the field. He even served at the Treasury as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy in 97, 98. Simon Johnson is also multifaceted. Many of you best know him for his bestseller during and following the financial crisis, 13 Bankers, but of course he moved on into fiscal issues. He moved on to public service on various commissions, including working with the CFPB and with the FDIC, and the what's it called? The Risk Committee. Sorry.
Systemic Risk Council.
The Systemic Risk Council. Simon, of course, also is very broad, had done seminal work on international development and growth, is still running what he co-founded at MIT, the Global Entrepreneurship Lab, and many in Washington knew him from his stint as chief economist at the IMF. I really want to, however, stress not just their qualifications and their qualities, but the fact that they're embodied in this book, Jumpstarting America, that it is radical centrism. It is not pandering to one or the other side, and it's radical not just in the amount of ambition it has, but the amount they put on the line. So they have, as the front matter inside their front cover, 102 places for Jumpstarting America. And if you don't like to read maps, they have the list of the 102 places in the back. There are very few policy proposals that come so specific with so much on the line. And for that reason alone, I'm delighted to welcome Simon and then Jonathan to our stage, please.
Thanks very much, Adam, for those extremely kind words of introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming out today. My name is Simon Johnson. I'm going to speak to you just a few minutes first, a little bit of framing and motivation. Then John will speak to you, and then I'll come back at the end and close out to make sure we fully get across our policy proposal. So a radical centrism, I like that, Adam, and maybe we should develop that as our tagline. Our tagline currently is more good jobs. That's what we think our research is about. That's what we think the book is about. And the motivating example, it comes actually from the private sector, from the Amazon HQ2 bidding process, which, if you remember, started in the fall of 2017. Amazon said, we're going to create 50,000 good new jobs, average income at least $100,000 per year, maybe higher. 50,000 new jobs somewhere in America, away presumably from Seattle and probably away from the West Coast. And they said, you've got 6 weeks to tell us if you're interested, which is a pretty short deadline in this business. 238 communities across the country, across North America, raised their hand and said, yes, we want those jobs, and we will provide you with tax breaks, infrastructure, other things. Now, why? Why did and this is basically all of the metropolitan statistical areas or urban conglomerations that could possibly qualify one of these jobs. Why? If you look at the headline numbers, if you look at growth rates, or if you look at stated unemployment rates, you know, it's not that bad. There's been a long, difficult recovery. You know that very well. But the economy seemed to have improved at that headline level. We think the answer is well-founded and genuine anxiety about the future of work. People are concerned about the long-term effects, the decades-long effects of automation, the difficulties of globalization, a lot of positives of globalization. We talk about that frequently, including in my work, including in this room. But we also recognize have been unintended consequences, including for jobs in some parts of the country. And of course, the financial crisis compounded these issues. So even if jobs have come back in particular communities, people feel pressure, they're worried. Amazon seemed to offer, and this was dangled by people around Amazon, certainly, a transformative potential of this investment. What actually happens? Well, as you know, Amazon picks two cities, New York and Washington, D.C., or Northern Virginia, larger D.C. area, that are actually doing pretty well, and actually doing pretty well in terms of the tech sector. Why does Amazon pick those places? Well, they're quite upfront about it, actually. They say, we need the talent. And that's a key issue, and something we're going to come back to several points. Talent attracts talent in the modern American economy. We have some large cities that are doing extremely well. Perhaps they're becoming too congested. In fact, New York, in the end, of course, turns down Amazon because some people don't like the price, some people don't like the gentrification implications. We can talk about those dimensions as well. But the key question that we're trying to address in this book is, if you want more good jobs, and we need to demonstrate this or discuss this with you, if you feel the private sector's ability to generate those jobs and to spread them around the country is limited, is there a role for the public sector? We say yes. Through what mechanism? Well, we're emphasizing infrastructure, but a particular form of infrastructure, scientific infrastructure, the infrastructure that lets you create science, lets you commercialize science, and lets you build new hubs, and we'll get to the hubs in a minute. So it's public effort on science, spreading it around the country, and this is really important, creating mechanisms to capture the upside, including the financial upside, and share that upside with all Americans. I now turn the floor over to John.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks so much to PIE for having me here as an interloper. And I appreciate you giving us the opportunity. In this book, we really sort of structure the book in three sections. And the first section is the history. And it's really sort of a forgotten history of how science made America great. And really our history lesson begins with the spring of 1940. Hitler had just blitzed across Europe with new technologies we didn't even know existed and certainly didn't know could be applied in warfare. Meanwhile, the US in 1939 had produced 6 tanks, had torpedoes that exploded before they left the ship, and had an army practicing with broomsticks instead of guns. So at that moment, Vannevar Bush, a former dean of MIT, knocked on the door of the White House and said to FDR, I'll tell you what, want to win World War II, I want you to give me unlimited money to hire as many scientists as I can to invent the technology to win the war. And the FDR said, okay. And Vannevar Bush set up an institution which at one point employed 2/3 of all physicists in America, and they invented the technologies that won World War II. Now, there's obviously a lot of else that went into winning World War II, but the technological advances, most notably radar, invented at MIT, were key to winning the war. What Vannevar Bush didn't emphasize, and what scientists continually did not emphasize, was the economic benefits of those inventions. The fact that those inventions led to follow-on innovations by the private sector, which led to goods, which led to jobs. So remember, what was the first microwave called? The radar range, because it came out of inventing radar. And that's just one example of time and time again, as we look to the history from World War II to Sputnik in '57 to landing a man on the moon. The first 3 chapters of our book, time and time again, go through how the government invested in R&D in a big way. By 1964, 2% of the entire US economy was publicly financed R&D, 1 in every $50. And it paid off in a big way. It paid off in industries, from industries based like satellites to digital computing. Let's talk about digital computing, the backbone of the modern American economy. The digital computing industry came out of government efforts to first invent digital computing, to put the money in, and then to support the private sector in perfecting it. So IBM in the 1950s, half of their R&D budget was publicly funded. And all of their new projects they're developing were to be sold to the public sector. Indeed, before the public sector contracted to have an air defense system built, the longest computer program ever written was 50,000 lines. The government contracted with RAND to write a 1 million line program to write an air defense system. They set the standards, and that then followed on and created new industries and good jobs dominated by America. The satellite industry, which came out of publicly funded R&D, has 170,000 jobs in America, paying good wages because we were first to the table. But then what happened? What happened in a nutshell was 3 things. First of all, scientists got a little overconfident, perhaps. We spent more time promising free power for all and nuclear-powered pens, and less time talking about the fact that there was radiation poisoning. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was sort of a shot across the bow that scientists had kind of ignored. The second problem was scientists and politicians stopped seeing eye to eye. It's easy to see eye and eye when you've got a Hitler or a Sputnik. It's harder when the targets get more vague. And as we say in our book, if you speak truth to power, power might cut your funding. And that's what happened. The third thing that happened was we started facing budgetary pressures. First the Vietnam War, then the Great Society, and then the anti-tax revolution that started in the 1980s. And continuing most recently with the debt ceiling fights, which led to huge squeezes on the discretionary side, which has led public financing of R&D to fall from 2%, by far the world leading, to 0.7% of GDP, which is now barely making the top 10 in the world. Okay, so we've backed off from this commitment. Now, the natural question then is, why do we care? I mean, you guys are economists. Simon teaches a business school after all. Why do we care? Why can't the private sector do this? And we're big believers in the private sector. We think the private sector has to lead. But we have to recognize that basic economics tells us, this isn't socialism, okay, basic economics, Econ 101 tells us that R&D will be underinvested in by the private sector for two reasons. The first reason is that private companies do not account for the spillovers of their new scientific investments on other companies. Decades of economic research have shown that the private rate of return to R&D is pretty high, maybe 20%, but it's a risky investment. The social rate of return to R&D is 2 to 3 times higher. The spillovers are enormous. And when R&D spills over, private companies don't want to do that. So the example we like to use to explain this from the book is the story of the development of statins, a miracle drug many of us may be on in this room, that is a cholesterol-lowering drug that saves lives. Well, statins were first being discovered in the early 1980s in a battle between Merck in the US and Sankyo in Japan. Suddenly, Sankyo stopped their trials, and word got out that some dogs had developed lesions in their animal trials. So Merck went to them and said, oh my God, what happened? And Sankyo said, we're not going to tell you. You're a competitor. Merck said, we'll pay you, we'll partner with you. They said, no, we're not going to help our competitor tell them what happened in our research labs. So Merck shut down their development as well. 5 years later, some academic researchers petitioned the FDA to let them try a special trial of statins again. They did. It turned out nothing was wrong with the dogs related to the statins. And statins are now a miracle. They save hundreds of thousands of lives a year. Yet they were delayed 5 to 7 years because we didn't share the benefits of the spillovers of research ideas. Fundamental science spills over. That's the whole idea. But private companies aren't interested in doing that fundamental science. The second problem is that even when private individuals have good ideas, they need the financing to turn them into new companies. Now you might say, hey, but we have the venture capital sector. It's actually all the envy of the world. And indeed, 60% of the entire stock market capitalization in the US is companies that were funded with VC dollars. But VCs today aren't interested in funding basic science. They've moved on to what they call the pay and spray model, which is they basically invest a little bit of money in a lot of different things and hope one of them within a few years will pop. They are interested in things which cost a lot of money and take a long time. Indeed, there's a name for this. It's called the Valley of Death in investment, which is investments which are risky, take a long time to show returns, and which are expensive, are not the focus of this kind of venture capital investment. And here another example we like to use in the book is the example of a battery company in Boston, Boston Power. Now, battery technology is a huge growth industry for the future. It's unambiguous. Boston Power had a very successful lithium-ion battery technology with customers including Saab and Hewlett-Packard, but they wanted to get bigger. They wanted to build a $200 million plant in western Massachusetts, creating 500 new jobs in that area. But no venture capitalists would finance it. They said, that's too risky, it's too much money, we're not going to do it. Well, no venture capitalists in America, but a venture capitalist from China would do it, backed by the Chinese government, with one small condition, it's just they had to move the plant to China. So now the Boston Power plant is in China, it's growing rapidly, and those are jobs that aren't in western Massachusetts, but rather in China. So these sorts of failures, and what we do in the book that we like is we have these fun anecdotes, which are fun to talk about, but actual hard empirical evidence. Not really, we aren't doing primary research here, but lots of hard empirical evidence from dozens of secondary studies that we cite in the book make this case. They might say, well, that's all well and good, but just because the private sector is doing it doesn't mean the government can make it better. Well, here we turn to the evidence that's not just historical, but modern day, that the government R&D does pay off. It pays off in terms of more jobs and faster growth. And here we come to my second favorite example in the book. I'll come to my favorite in a little bit. My second favorite example in the book is the example of what happened when the late 1980s, when the Nobel Prize winning biologist Walter Gilbert, who'd figured out how to map the human gene, won the Nobel Prize for it, and had founded Biogen, a very successful startup company, wanted to start a company to map the human genome, create a map of the entire human genome. Wanted to raise $10 million, no one would give it to him. Because the private investors were like, what's in it for us? You map the human genome, it's out there. I'm not gonna make any money off that. So fortunately, the federal government was convinced it was a worthwhile investment, and we kicked off the 13-year, $3 billion human genome project. What's come out of that, besides mapping the human genome? Today, we have a genomics industry in America which has 290,000 jobs at an average wage of $70,000 a year, and in 1 year, pays $6 billion in taxes. So a $3 billion 13-year investment yielded an industry was the backbone of an industry which pays $6 billion in taxes in a year. And we go through study after study that shows the enormous returns to public investment in R&D. So we need more of this public investment. The private sector is not doing it at the scale we need. And once again, we're not trying to say the private sector doesn't invest in R&D. This is not a black or white. It just doesn't do enough. The returns are there to do much, much more. But we also have to recognize that the public sector's made mistakes too. There's limitations on the public sector. One limitation is geographic. I'll talk about that in a minute. The other is a key political limitation, which is sometimes R&D fails. We talk about the story of Solyndra. That's the first word out of most people's mouths when we talk about this book is what about Solyndra? Well, let's talk about Solyndra. As part of the stimulus package, the Obama administration invested almost $40 billion in clean energy. One of the companies it gave money to, quite a lot of money to, was Solyndra, which through both some bad luck and some poor, maybe perhaps criminal mismanagement, went bankrupt. That was terrible and caused enormous criticism of this whole program, but that was 1.3% of the portfolio. The rest of the portfolio has been successful. We have created a solar panel producing industry in America out of those investments. All the rest of the investments have been paying back on schedule. And you talk about one of those successful companies in America, Tesla, has been successful through the public R&D that helped jumpstart their production facilities. So we can make this happen, but only if we recognize that risk involves failure. If you don't fail, you aren't taking enough risk. And we have to set up a system, and Simon will talk about the politics. We have to keep that in mind as we set up a system that's going to work here. But the other problem with public R&D is that it follows the same problem of private R&D, which is geographic concentration, which is that basically American growth and jobs and technology become concentrated in a small set of superstar cities. Okay? And if you look at, we're talking about San Francisco, Seattle, LA, Boston, New York, Washington. These cities are where all the good jobs are going. Indeed, fun fact, if you look from 2007 to 2016 at net establishment growth in America, half of all net establishment growth in the whole country is in New York and Washington, D.C. Okay? So basically, we are really agglomerating. Now, agglomeration is one of these words economists like to make up fancy words for easy ideas so we can get paid big bucks. But basically, agglomeration simply means, as Simon said, talent follows talent. And in this knowledge economy, agglomeration's gotten extreme. And so talent is following talent to the same set of places. Simon now has taken to asking his students in his MBA classes, where are you going to look for a job? And they all say the same 6 places. Okay? It's just this pulling apart, and the rest of the country is hurting. And that's important not just economically, this isn't just a welfare program, but it's important politically, which is it's going to be hard to say we want more R&D, and by the way, we're just going to give it all this to Cambridge and Berkeley. That's a hard sell. And in fact, you don't have to. So we can put up the picture from our website here. It's the map from the book, but it's actually on our interactive website as well. What we did is we went to the data, and we said, how many places in America have at least 100,000 people in working age population, have at least 25% college educated, so highly educated, and have an average house price of less than $265,000. Sounds like a relief here, right? Places that are affordable and convenient technology hubs. There are 102 such places in 36 states with 80 million people living in their metro areas. We are a country of enormous opportunity. Okay, they're spread all over. You can see they're a lot clustered in the industrial Northeast, but we have a lot in the South, fewer west of the Mississippi, but still a number there. They're all over the country. And these are places that can become next generation technology hubs. Places like Rochester, New York, which I visited just last week, which has an incredible education system, an incredibly skilled population, an average house price of $170,000, and is a natural home for the booming optics and photonics industry. These places are all over the country. And the federal government has a history of selecting things like this. You might think, well, the federal government doesn't ever pick winners, but that, of course, locational winners, but of course we know that's wrong. Look at where we're standing right now. As Simon likes to point out, one of the opening numbers in Hamilton, okay, is how they chose a swamp over Philadelphia, okay? And today, Washington, D.C. is the 5th highest wage city in America, and Philadelphia is 16th. From that, through the Tennessee Valley Authority, through military bases, through land-grant colleges, throughout our history, the federal government has made decisions that have impacted local economies. And it can do so again. It can do so again in this context. And Simon will talk about our policy proposal for doing so. But I just want to end before he does with my favorite story in the book, because partly I get to potentially stump you all with a question. I'm going to ask you a question. Please do not say the answer out loud. And please do not be ashamed if you get it wrong, because right now, 4 out of 550 people have gotten this question. Okay? Here's the question. What city in America is the home of the computer microsimulation industry for our nation and the largest university in America by enrollment? Don't say that out. Think for a minute. Okay, now, except for those who know the answer because they've read our book already, raise your hand if you guessed Orlando, Florida. Okay, so now we're 4 for 600. Okay, don't feel ashamed. Great story. 1956, the editor of Atlanta Sentinel endorses a little-known politician named Lyndon Johnson for president. It does it again in 1960. 1964, Johnson calls him up and says, "You've been very good to me. What do you want?" He says, "We want a Navy base." Now, Orlando, as you may know, is landlocked, but damn it, Lyndon Johnson gave him a Navy base. There's a nice cement ship out front. And what do you do at a landlocked Navy base? You train. So it became the training center for the Navy, including a small battle simulation unit that had been in Long Island. Johnson grabbed from there and moved to Orlando. Fast forward to 1978. There's a mid-sized university called the University of Central Florida with a very innovative president who notices land is cheap below his university because interest rates are sky high. He notices you can buy land at about $2,000 an acre for about 1,000 acres below his university. So he partners with local business leaders to go to the Navy and say, hey, you've got this simulation unit. Now they're doing some sort of early computer simulation on battle. Why don't you move that below our university? We'll build a research park around it, and we'll go from there. Today, the Central Florida Research Park has 10,000 employees, the 3rd largest in the nation. East Orange County, 45 minutes from Disney, has added 100,000 jobs over the last 30 years. And University of Central Florida didn't just take Duke to the last minute in the NCAAs. They are the largest university by enrollment in America and have the 13th ranked electrical engineering department in the country. Okay? We can do this. But we have to recognize it's going to take a jump start. And what I mean by that? Well, let's come back to Orlando. The bad news is, what happens in Orlando? People go there, they work with universities to start companies, and then once the companies get medium-sized, they leave and go to New York and San Francisco and Seattle and Boston and DC. Why? Because there's no financing. Orlando's 45th in the country in venture capital. People don't think of it as a technology hub. They want to go where all the talent is. So if you're going to take that next step with an Orlando, with a Rochester, with a Baton Rouge, Louisiana, all the places on our map, they're going to need a jump start. And that's what our proposal does. Simon will tell you about that.
So our proposal has 3 pieces that we regard as being very closely connected. The first is a substantial scaling up of public commitment to research and development. Spend more money on science. Think about ways in which you can support the commercialization of it. You could do that anywhere in the country. You could, if you want to give more money to MIT, I'm sure they'd be willing. We're not pitching for them. We're pointing out that you will certainly get a very good return. I think in economic terms, no substantial loss of productivity for those research dollars if you spread them around the country. And you will also get substantially more political support because we feel, and many other people seem to feel, that science has become something of an elite pursuit and it favors only a few people. Whereas what we saw in the post-war period and what we envisage going forward is the kind of investment that generates a lot of new middle-class jobs. So there's a geographic dimension to that. Now, you could say, and I expect that you will say in a few minutes when we get to the discussion, well, fine on the economics perhaps, but the politics are extremely complicated. Now, as John already mentioned, we do have some precedent for allocating or deciding on resources, how resources are allocated, particularly when in a situation where there's scarce resources and where local people, local politicians are going to feel very strongly. The leading example is, of course, the Base Realignment and Closures Commission, which is an independent commission. It's closed more than 300 bases over the decades. And it's set up with, of course, congressional authorization. It's only going to work, you're only going to spend money if Congress approves. But it's run independently, it's run professionally to a substantial degree, and then Congress approves the list or doesn't on an up or down basis. So Congress absolutely has to have a say and is involved in the design. Congress signs off at the end, but you're delegating to an independent agency or independent commission a process through which you're going to make this decision. Now, what kind of process would you want? Well, we suggest drawing on the experience of Amazon and other companies that have these competitions across jurisdictions, but not for tax dollars. You're not looking for tax breaks here. By the way, state and local government gives away every year at least $50 billion to corporate entities. The studies show that almost all of the investment decisions that they're trying to support would have taken place anyway in the place they ultimately end up. So you get nothing for that money except a transfer from local taxpayers to these corporate entities, and that undermines local services, undermines education, undermines public safety in some instances. So don't run the competition. Run the competition in an open, transparent, accountable way. That's absolutely essential. Don't run this competition for tax breaks. Run it for matching contributions. That could be cash. We think a lot of times it will be real estate. I'll come on to that in a moment. It could be strategies for building an education and strengthening local education so that people have the skills necessary to support this shift towards more science-oriented jobs. That's what's going to make an appealing bid. How many places should you have? Well, more than one and substantially less than 50. This is not an entitlement. It's not one state gets it, because that's going to be quite a different pathway for the politics. This would be, in our proposal, between 20 and 30 new science hubs. There are plenty of places where you can put them. There's a lot of science to be invented. We have backed away dramatically from pushing forward the technological frontier in this country. We've got examples in our book. Happy to go through those if you want. Other countries, naturally, have read our history. They paid attention to this. They realize that if you get in early, John mentioned the satellite industry, you get in early, you invent that basic technology, you build lasting private sector jobs coming out of that. So other people are doing that. Spend more on R&D, spread it around through a competition, that's our proposal, scale it up, 20 to 30 new hubs. But here's the third piece of our proposal, which is we think that Americans need to participate in a financial sense directly from the benefits of the next big American technological boom. Alaska, I would remind you, shares oil revenues, some of their oil revenues, with every citizen or every resident on a per capita basis. It's a lump sum, everybody gets the same amount every year. It's typically between $1,000 and $2,000 a year. Now, that may not sound like a lot of money to some of you, but that typically lifts 20,000 Alaskans out of poverty. It's a cash dividend return for the public support and efforts and system that makes it possible for private companies to drill for oil in Alaska. We propose to do the same thing with technology. You see, if you buy part one and part two, you're going to make a science investment and you're going to concentrate it in some places. You have to concentrate it because the agglomeration effect dominates. We're beyond standard agglomeration. We're in some sort of hyper-agglomeration phase. Talent attracts talent. So you may pick existing hubs or go for new ones, but you're going to concentrate the money if you want to have impact. Think of what that does to real estate prices. Kendall Square, next to where our offices are, was a completely unappealing place in the 1980s when I was there as a graduate student, and some of you may have had similar experiences in Cambridge. Kendall Square was such a empty place, devoid of all signs of prosperity, that was actually quite safe to walk around. You would not get mugged in Kendall Square. Central Square was much more dangerous because there was no money in Kendall Square, obviously. Kendall Square is now among the most expensive commercial real estate in the country because of the success of the biotech industry, because of some smart decisions made by MIT, because the local government got behind it. Who's made a profit out of that? Well, lots of people have done well, including the private landowners in Kendall Square. So you create a hub The people who own the real estate in the center of that hub are going to do extremely well. We propose that as you assemble these bids, run this competitive process, think about the contribution of local government. Think about the land swap deals that they're already doing for corporate entities. That's what Amazon was asking for, and that's what they got, among other things. Do that strategically to create and capture upside value, the capital appreciation of the land, which you could take out in various ways. Run that through an endowment fund like Alaska does, the primary goal of which is just to buffer these annual payments. Put a cash dividend in the pocket of every American every year as a result of this technology success. We built, okay, I'm an immigrant. I've only been here for 30 years. You and those of you who are here and those of you whose parents were here in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s built one of the most incredible technological, scientific generation machines the world has ever seen. It created enormous value for many people, and for a time, it created many middle-class jobs. Those jobs are coming under pressure. You could retreat from automation. I don't think you're going to give up your cell phones and your laptops. You could retreat from globalization. I think that will be highly inadvisable and come with a lot of costs. Or you could embrace the technology, embrace the science, invest in it. We should do this for ourselves, for our own productivity. This is, at its heart, a productivity-boosting proposal, period. When you boost productivity in this way, you're going to get more good jobs. We should do this for ourselves. But if we don't do it, other countries around the world are going to do this. They are doing it. We document this in our book, and happy to discuss it more in the question and answer. Other countries will do this. We are not bashing other countries in this book. We are not saying that they're doing anything wrong whatsoever. We are saying they've read American history more carefully than many Americans. And they have drawn the right lessons from it, which is it's a public-private partnership. You make the public strategic scientific investment, you reap the private sector, good jobs, benefit. And you can share that prosperity much more broadly in a convincing manner and in a way that will have sustainable, truly lasting political support. Thank you very much.
Well, the mic works. A big thank you to Jonathan, to Simon. That was terrific. The book on sale here and widely available, Jumpstarting America. Let me, if I could, pose a couple questions, and they're going to be a little bit skeptical sounding because you guys have had the floor for a while, so I'm going to try to push you, and then we'll open it up to our distinguished audience who can be as skeptical or as supportive as they wish. Some of economists, when we look at your map of all those, whatever you want to call them, future jumpstart cities, look at that map and see something that goes in very much the opposite direction of what you've said, which is that there's almost no convergence in societies, even ones that have stable law, even ones that have great investment. And you mentioned that you talk about other countries, but actually in the book, that was one thing that I felt was missing, but that just comes from my bias. There wasn't very much review of what like Germany or Japan or the UK have done in terms of their regional policy. And you know, the short answer is Japan hasn't done much, but Germany and UK have both chumped a lot of money into their, what they'd call second-tier cities. And there's been very little convergence there either. So how do you reconcile sort of your optimism about the idea that we target this, that, or the other city, it leaps ahead, with sort of the facts on the ground that you never seem to get convergence to Tokyo or London or New York and Washington?
Well, I think you raise a number of good issues. So as Simon always emphasizes, coming from the UK, this is a really big country in terms of area. And we're not going to end divergence. We're not going to make every city in America the same wealth, but we can have more than 6 places that are focus of technology. We're a big enough country, we can have 30, we can have 40. We can have multiple places that are much more successful rather than everything just being in 6 places or 7 or 10 places. So I think that's the important point. We're not implying full convergence, but we think we can have a lot more spread. And the important point is, that's why the 80 million number is so striking of people living in these metro areas. We talk about the areas that are hurting today, the opioid crisis, other areas. Those places, the opioid cities, they're commuting distance to Cincinnati. I mean, we are not talking about leaving a lot of their country behind. There are lots of places that are hurting today where you can't build the labs, but they're commuting distance to places where you can build the labs. So I think that's point one. Point two, on the international evidence, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of failures of redistribution policy. Other countries are much more aggressive. I think the lesson we've learned, and this is discussed in a number of articles, is that sort of pure kind of place-based welfare doesn't work. Just saying, redistributing money to certain places, or at least it's got a mixed track record. Sometimes it does work. There's a mixed track record. In Germany, there's an example of East Germany's not worked well, but there's another example of opportunity zones in Germany that has worked well. So I think that has a mixed track record. But I think the idea of investing, not just giving them money, but partnering with them to develop growth centers in places which can really own technologies and grow around them, I think that's pretty new, and I don't think other countries have tried that. Let me just end on one example. The fastest growing city in China is Haiwei, I believe it's pronounced, Heiwei. I don't know exactly how it's pronounced. Fastest growing city in China, which was nothing till the government put a research park there, which is now one of the major research parks in China, and it's become the fastest growing city in China. So is China equal? No. But have they managed to find places outside Shanghai and et cetera to build? Yes, they have.
A second question. Thanks, Jonathan. It's very clear. And as always, you're out there saying the perfect is not the enemy of the good. You've got progress to make. Continuing though on this international theme, both of you, particularly Simon towards the end, and in the book, make reference to the idea that, if the US blows it, doesn't learn from its history, these jobs will go elsewhere. And you gave a specific example with, I think it was Boston Power.
Boston Power, yeah.
And I appreciate what Simon said at the end, that, in a sense, that's fair. This is other countries just doing this. Again, though, that's a somewhat striking, I guess there's two pieces to this. First is just on the economics. We have a lot of examples going back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, where the Japanese wanted to get into flat panel screens, which you talk about here. The Germans were very busy building up their solar panel market. There were various things which, at best, at least I understand the literature, is like what you would say mixed results. There's no consistent evidence that this has really done that much good. So the first question is just sort of how realistic is it that other countries are going to actually do this if the US doesn't? That doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It can still be worth doing even if no one else is doing it. But the second is the flip side. So you've mentioned quite logically, and Larry Summers in a speech he gave here about 2 weeks ago on secular stagnation also mentioned sort of there's this kind of useful motivation that if we can make the Chinese, this isn't your words, by the way, just to be clear, but if we can make the Chinese sort of competitive threat motivate us, like we had the Soviet Union as this great motivating threat for technological progress in the 40s and 50s, that would be a good thing. So, I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about politically, is that what you're hoping for, that we can sort of capitalize on this sense of threat?
So let me take the second question first. I think you're absolutely right that the general threat of the Soviet Union and then the launch of Sputnik in 1957 really crystallized for Americans the fact that they were not paying that much attention to science and technology, and also we were falling behind in terms of training people. So the result was not just a big push on satellites and the space program. It was also the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which greatly increased federal support for teaching of math and physics in colleges and high schools, and for the first time provided federal support, actually grants, not loans, to help low-income people with talent go to college, because the Soviets were perceived, I think correctly, to be doing a better job of sourcing talent and applying talent to their national priorities. So I think we recognize that and we talk about it. I think we are trying to be very careful not to be scaremongers and not to say, oh my goodness, China is taking over or China is one or anyone else has. I think that's not correct. I think there are competitive pressures. And I think we will get a larger share of the good jobs that come out of the global process of new technology creation. If we're at the forefront, we'll also have a bigger say on the ethics. So to the extent that people are concerned about synthetic biology, which is a sector we highlight, to the extent that people are worried about some of the ways that might be used, if you're a player and if you're a significant contributor to the new knowledge being created, you're going to have a seat at the table, and you may actually hold the pen when the rules get written. Perhaps you don't get to write all of the rules by yourself.
Great.
Second, what was the first part?
Sorry, the first part was just saying there were these examples in the past of governments picking technologies, and I was internationally, and it didn't seem to work out that well. So what's different about this?
Well, look, other countries should speak for themselves. I mean, we really dug deep into the American experience, and we're convinced that and we go through it in detail, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the US did make these strategic commitments, mostly not for economic reasons, right? They were mostly for national security type of reasons, but they absolutely wanted to create, not just a specific machine, but the ability to run an air defense system, which becomes the basis of IBM's commercial computing system, which IBM then becomes the most valuable company in the United States in the 1970s. So there was a deliberate strategic direction to what America was doing, even though it wasn't primarily to reap the economic rewards, and they weren't thinking that much about the jobs. That wasn't the top priority. So we think in the American system, there has been success. However, we would also stress, I think this is a really important point, and I'm glad you're leading us in a direction, that if we worry that in the current American system, let's say you do 20 of these things, and 19 were successful, and one was an abject failure. An inordinate amount of attention will be devoted to the abject failure, and people say, oh my goodness, you've got failure. Venture capital makes its money off a few successes and a lot of failures. In the public sector, we've managed to twist our priorities and misunderstand, I think, the nature of invention, because it's also about being at the frontier rather than trying to catch up with anyone. So if we want to stay at the frontier, and I think we should, then you're going to make some good bets and some bad bets. You can't anticipate fully which technologies work out, and that's a little bit, I think, what other countries have run into. Although, just back to the first question, as somebody from the north of England, from Sheffield, and who grew up in a city that became very depressed economically and lost a lot of manufacturing jobs, among other things, I think the commitments made by the central government, also by local government, also by local business, in rebuilding sectors, including around the University of Sheffield, were a remarkable part of the relative recovery and relative strength of that city, which has still got, North of England still has issues, and still, I thought the Northern Powerhouse idea, which a recent conservative government proposed, was a terrific idea. I think other countries would do well to look through this lens at whether it makes sense for their economies and their politics.
And just to editorialize a second, I realize it wasn't a main focus of the book, but one of the things which I liked very much in the book was what you were just saying and what you referred to with the Solinka or whatever example, that the portfolio, if you think about it as a portfolio of investments by the public sector, you don't expect every one of them to hit. And arguably, as you mentioned, the total social return is much higher. And we do have this skewed perspective of one failure. And so I think it's really valuable you all are doing that. So in that spirit, one last question before I open it up. One thing which we've been harping on here at the Peterson Institute, and along with other people, is the idea that there has been this very real productivity growth slowdown, not just in the US, but across the rich countries. It may be the latest data may show a slight uptick, but hasn't fundamentally shifted yet. I'm going to be very Washington. So let's say they implement your plan, what they being, the collective wisdom of Congress and local governments and state land grant universities and mayors, and you get 25 of these cities. 5, 10 years down the road, roughly what order of public investment in terms of money would you have expected to be invested? What kinds of returns would you expect? How much would you expect this would move the needle on national productivity growth? Again, I'm being very Washington, but sort of what's your bumper sticker of the economic impact if people took your program?
It's a great question. Early on, I talked, we have our CBO friends here. Early on, I talked about my experience with healthcare reform, and, you have to score this. You have to know what it's going to do. So what we did is we looked at the evidence on that. And our view is that there is compelling midterm evidence, not 1 year, but less than 10 year, midterm evidence that you can get a major jobs boost, good jobs boost from R&D investment. This comes from both, what's quite neat about it is actually there's a lot of research studies which coalesce around a number which is about $25,000 a job, which is much less than stimulus spending. We then
And much, much less than tariffs at 700,000 a job. But anyway,
I
continue.
think that's infinity, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then what we did was kind of neat. We said, well, we got about $25,000 a job, and then it actually turns out if you look at what the federal government has invested in Orlando and divide by the number of jobs created, it comes out to $26,000 a job. So it's kind of a nice confirmation. So we think the question is then how big do you have to go? Now we throw out a number of there $100 billion a year. That's a big number. That's 0.5% of GDP. By the way, that still only takes us halfway back to where we were at our peak. But it moves us from about 10th in the world to close to the top of the list in the world. We estimate that would create about 4 million new jobs. We don't really have a great prediction for productivity growth. That's not really where the evidence has focused. But I think the important point is not that the number, the important point that is go big or go home. That basically we have these advanced manufacturing institutes that the Obama administration did, and they were great, and they're a few $1 million in a few places, and that's wonderful. But it's not going to stop the companies from leaving Rochester and Orlando and going to the superstar cities. If you really want to commit that this is going to be on the scale, you look at Austin as a place that's sort of in between our two. It's moving its way up to superstar status. It took a long time, and that was a lot of, if you want to say we want, this place to be the next Austin, move up that scale, that's going to take a big commitment. And we think if it's not 100 billion and it's less, then probably you want less places. But we don't want to end up spreading it so thin that you don't get the jump start you need.
I think some of the most interesting evidence that's relevant to your question, Adam, is from Moretti and Shea, who point out that because we created this model in which you get the hyperagglomeration with a lot of congestion, very high real estate prices in a few places, but it's still the case that companies want to go there from Orlando, they go to Silicon Valley, that what you're basically doing is excluding a large set of talented people from connecting with the opportunities. The opportunities are not going to the people are having a hard time getting to the opportunities. They suggest that may have lowered growth rates by about a third over some period of decades. So if you could better match opportunities and people, either some people say change the zoning in San Francisco, in Boston. I would not advise you to spend your careers doing that. That's not going to happen. So find other ways to better get a match there. Then we should be looking at a significant but hard to be precise on boost to productivity growth.
Great, thank you. Let me open it up now for questions. If you could move to the standing mic. There's a standing mic back. There's a traveling microphone with Jessica here.
Yeah, hi.
If you could,
Steve Charnovitz from...
Steve, wait 1 second. Sorry. Just to remind everyone who's not as familiar as you are, that if you're going to make a question or comment, please identify yourself and please make it a question. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Steve Charnovitz, George Washington University. I think it's a fascinating presentation. You've identified a really important problem and you've offered a creative solution, and that's pretty rare in a lot of studies. I want to focus, though, on Adam's question a bit. It seems to me the problem is always getting the public's attention for the need for something this big. And I was associated with Dr. Bergston's Competitiveness Policy Council in the early 90s, which made recommendations on the need for more research and the importance of that to growth, competitiveness, and good jobs. But the recommendations of that council, despite all the good work, didn't have a long-term impact on U.S. policy. So it's hard to push the needle on these sorts of things. So Adam said, one of the things Adam said, how about the China argument? And if you look back at the history, and the history certainly starts earlier in the 1940s, a lot of work done by the federal government research in the early part of the 20th century, but it was World War I, World War II, those enemies, Russia with respect to Sputnik and the Cold War and some of the things you mentioned. Nowadays, the big villain is China. And the narrative, though, is that China is breaking the rules, they're unfair, etc. So, that's the narrative. They're bad actors. But there's very little being talked about the good things that China is doing, that they are doing forward-looking industrial policy, in a sense, the China 2025. And Belt and Road is an amazing infrastructure initiative that's tied to not only Chinese development, but foreign development. So to go back to Adam's question, and your answer was, well, we don't want to scare people, I think, or make it only about China. But I think Adam's point, if I understood it, was a deeper one, that if you're trying to motivate the American public and the Congress to think about how do you undertake a very expensive reform like this and the geographic angle you have on it, I think, is very good too. It's excellent, actually. How do you undertake something like that? Having a target. American history shows how important it is to have that target. And there's a lot of energy now being spent on China being a bad actor. But if we could change the narrative a little bit about how we've got to learn from China and compete with China, and we can do better than China, sort of thing, a race to the top with China, rather than simply trying to punish China, I think your narrative might be better received by the Congress.
That's what we say in the book. Please do take a look at the book. That's where we are. That's what we're saying. Actually, not so much learn from China, learn from ourselves and learn from American history and learn what worked. I think that's how I would see what the Chinese are doing. So we should study and make better use of our own history. That's my takeaway.
Sorry, one follow-up. You said, and obviously I'm sympathetic to the idea of not being a scaremonger, even though, as Steve said, there's sort of an obvious political economy rhetoric path here. But just sort of put your international economics hat on for a second. What happens if, even if it's a race to the top, China does Made in China 2025 and creates 2 more high bays? We do your program and recreate 20 of these cities. And then the EU, miracle of miracles, gets its act together and creates another 10 of these cities. Is that an inefficient outcome? I mean, in a meaningful sense, or is it there's plenty of room for everybody? Do we need to worry about not everybody can be at the frontier?
We are massive technology optimists. There is plenty of room on the frontier for lots of people to share it. And so we think there's lots of opportunities. Indeed, we have some great examples in the book of exciting areas. We were kind of pleased because one area we focused on early on was synthetic biology. And the week the book came out, it was on the cover of The Economist as a growth area. There's an area which the US government, through the NSF, sort of discovered and funded, which we became the world leaders in, which the NSF then stopped funding, and which China is now building research institutes around. There's plenty of examples like this. There's plenty, and we don't claim to be technology visionaries,
right,
just technology optimists. We found in our limited research so many positive examples. We think there's room for everything. But that said, there is a history of the person who moves first reaps more of the benefits. So while there's room for lots of things, and there'll be spillovers, and the whole world can benefit, after all, the whole world benefits from the technologies we invented after World War II. Right. There is a benefit to going first, economically, and we talked about trade, stealing, and other things, all setting the rules of the road. If you think about new 5G standards, the company that develops 5G also sets the 5G standards. And so I think we can go first. And let me just say one other thing about making sure the frontier moves forward. One thing we emphasize in the book, probably not even enough, is it's not just about demand, it's about supply. That if you want to move the frontier forward, you don't just have to create those new ideas, you have to educate the public so they can take those good jobs. And I think it's a dual frontier. It's a frontier of both ideas and a frontier of demand and a frontier of supply. And both of those are important.
Thank you. Mike, please.
Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute. First of all, a fascinating presentation. And I guess my first comment would be that this sort of struck me as the F-35 model of congressional funding model for public R&D, which I wish you good luck with. But the question is to this issue of agglomeration and scale. I mean, Jonathan, you mentioned at the end that you really think that 100 billion is sort of the bottom of the range of resources.
I didn't say bottom. I was throwing a number out there, but it has to be big.
But anyway, I mean, that we're talking about a lot of money. And I guess my sense is, and this was also, I guess, illustrated a little bit by your Orlando example, is that what you're proposing is something that can deliver sectoral hubs in this case. I mean, in this case, it was naval battle systems and things like that. But as you also said yourself, I mean, this is, people still want to leave Orlando to go somewhere else, these sort of 6 or 8, whatever, well-known hubs. And my question is, how do you make what I read, and maybe I'm wrong, that is essentially a potential sectoral approach? I mean, you identify projects in a specific sector and you spread them out over enough cities, whether it's 102 or the 30 or 40 you mentioned. How do you actually create or recreate the hubs that people want to move to voluntarily? Because it seems to me that that's what you would have to strive for in the end to have succeeded, right? Is that solely a matter of just throwing enough money at it, or are there something else at play?
It's a great question. And I think, one thing we don't emphasize enough in our talks, I think, is we're trying to raise as many questions with this book as we answer them. We're trying to get this topic we think we have an interesting spin on a topic that economists have talked about a long time, which is more R&D. But there's a lot of great questions, including the one you raised. So let me give a couple of partial answers. First of all, it's partly scale. It's partly, it's sort of funny in this world of dropping communication costs, we have increasing value of face-to-face interaction. And 2/3 of venture capital America is in 5 cities. And basically it's scale. It's getting the financiers, it's getting the people to come to a place. And they're only going to do it if they know there's a commitment to build it to that scale. It's infrastructure. Rochester's a great city with a crappy airport. You need a better airport. You need more infrastructure. It's basically taking those efforts and really putting them in a commitment that brings the area to scale. Now, what does that take? How much does that take? We honestly don't know. I mean, basically, but it takes a lot, and it takes the ability. And I think here's the other thing that's key. It takes a local commitment too. So this comes to your question about sort of the European experience with sort of locational welfare.
Right.
That's why Simon talked about our competition idea. You need the place to demonstrate that they're going to spend the money appropriately on infrastructure, on education, on other things. You need a competition, and you need them to put some money in. You need a local buy-in. And that, I think, can help as well. We can basically say, you've got some good ideas, we'll put the money behind them, and let's work together to bring this thing to scale.
Okay. Here in front, please, and then at the back, Mike.
Fred Bergston here from the Peterson Institute. Back to the international dimension and the competition for this kind of investment. You mentioned the international competition is hot and heavy, a lot of concern about the China challenge, et cetera, et cetera. And as already been mentioned, Steve mentioned it explicitly, a lot of concern that some of the foreign competitors cheat. Big subsidies to state-owned enterprises, various dimensions to undermine the rules of the game in order to give their countries advantage. You talked about first mover benefits and the need to compete in that sense. So how far would you go? How would you allocate your $100 billion a year? Would you fight fire with fire when there are foreign subsidies involved in cutting edge industries? Would you explicitly try to bring back some of those high-tech industries on the grounds that the U.S. ought to have it? How much nationalism would creep into it? But in economic terms, how much would you straight out subsidize in order to advance your goals? You dumped on state and local subsidies as just cutting each other's throats, but at the national level, how far down that path would you go?
Sure. So great question, Fred. Thank you for that. I think that in some sense, our entire proposal is a subsidy. I mean, the key point is that from basic science knowledge creation, you get a lot of spillovers. And the reason that no private entity, no company, even individuals don't do this, and philanthropists do some of it, but they don't have enough money to move the needle. You're trying to get those spillovers. Now, you're not trying to subsidize existing activities. That's, I think, the key difference between what we're saying and perhaps what you're pushing us on. So it's not about subsidizing existing industries or industry that have moved jobs somewhere else, trying to entice it back. No, you're trying to invent new things. You're trying to look for the next big breakthrough science. And you do, in that context, have to make a decision about what areas of science you're going to pursue. I absolutely agree. We're urging consideration of a broad portfolio. We do think there are strategic choices. One side of the political spectrum right now likes what they call the Green New Deal. The response from Lamar Alexander, a Republican senator, is actually to argue we should do the next generation of nuclear power. So they've got different priorities, and that would probably be different streams of investment, but you could plug that into exactly the kind of mechanism and implementation that we're proposing. So I think we're looking for subsidies, but we're looking for a return on this subsidy or investment through commercialization, through new job creation. I think the entire process needs to be very transparent, well measured, judged. Presumably there'll be different paths proposed by various local entities, and you get a chance to see what works better and what works worse. But it is, I think, absolutely about better strategic use of your public dollars.
But if the key point, just to pick up on Fred's question, Simon, is you've just outlined a list of perfectly plausible, reasonable criteria, and the behavior of other countries is not mentioned in that list. You're neither saying if China's going in this industry, we'll choose, that means either we should or shouldn't go in that industry. You're saying if China's doing this kind of subsidy, that has no effect on the criteria. That's fine, but I just want to make explicit that your response to Fred basically leaves all that out.
Yeah, so thank you for that clarification and refinement. I think it's quite fair. If we look historically, it's certainly the case that technologies the US was pushing on hard, like radar, or of course atomic power and atomic weapons, or digital electronic computers, they were things that other countries were pursuing. Germany, the British were very advanced with early computers, jet aircraft, for example. The Germans and the British had early digital computers. So I think we should expect other countries that have relatively long-term vision and relatively deep pockets to also be pursuing anything we think about pursuing. I think that's just the nature of this. And if we do start doing things, they'll copy us. Right. And we should probably look really carefully, we are looking really carefully at what other countries do and think about what can have this kind of economic impact. Would the scale of their commitment affect, or the nature of their commitment affect how we would run this? It's a good question. I have to think about that. Yeah. Perhaps. But I think you want to, you can and do want to be to win as many of these new inventions as you possibly can. It's where do the jobs develop? By the way, the evidence says is very local. So it's places within a short distance of the labs or the universities that develop the technology. That's where the initial companies get founded. So we want to recognize that and get as much of that action as we can.
Great. So yeah, please at the back and then over there.
Yes, Jeremy Zettelmeier from the Institute. So I wanted to encourage you to maybe go a bit further in the direction which you just started going into, which is to explain how your approach contrasts from, I think, related approaches that have been around for a few years and now are coming in particular fashion also in the EU. So one is Mariana Mazzucato's New Entrepreneurial State. So as far as I can see, she essentially makes the same case that you made in part of your presentation, which is that there is a very close complementarity between what we view as private innovation and public funding. But her policy implications, I think, are quite markedly different. And the other one is sort of a new enthusiasm for, in my view, nationalist-tinged industrial policies in the EU, which are more along the lines that Fred was hinting at. So it's really about, in a way, trying to imitate China in identifying, specific technologies that are viewed as sort of the technology of the future, and then, building EU champions around these, infused with a lot of state spending. So, my impression is that what you're proposing is much easier to swallow for sort of globally minded economists, because it has a very, horizontal flavor. It has a very non-nationalist flavor. And the question is, are you doing this just because, you're nicer people, you were brought up in a different way, or do you really believe that your policies are going to work better compared to these other types of industrial policies?
Or both. You're right and you're nicer.
Well, I think so. There's a couple questions there. So for example, Mariana Mazzucato has an excellent book, which we rely on. I mean, I think we really, I think her book, in some sense, this book is actually putting together a bunch of ideas that aren't ours. It's just they haven't been put together this way. So the idea that our R&D, public R&D is very productive, that was in her book, that's been on a long time. The idea that we're diverging as a nation is really largely based on Enrico Moretti's work, which has been fantastic. And the idea that we ought to return some of these benefits more explicitly to the taxpayer is also based very much on what Mariana does. I think I think that what really we think stands apart about the way we're doing it is trying to put it in a package, and we think it works well together. We think we've kind of laid out a more explicit policy approach than these other books do, because we think the package works together. Now, come back to your question and Dr. Bergson's question. I think that, I think we need to recognize that this is not the only thing the U.S. government's going to do. This policy has to happen within the context of a larger set of policies. So all the same questions you asked about how does this fit in international trade policy, in a crowd of industrial organization economists, they say, how does this all fit within intellectual property policy in the US? Same set of questions. How does it interact with our patent laws, intellectual property? Great questions that we ran out of time, ran out of pages. But this is a lot of really good questions, and we need to think about how what we're doing sits within the context of both trade policy and the context of intellectual property policy. But regardless of where it sits, we need to learn from where the evidence is super clear. The evidence is super clear is there's really high rates of return, and that we're not going to realize those rates of return politically if we keep sending the money to Cambridge and Berkeley. And that those are the key sort of lessons we need to focus on. And I think everything else sort of follows from that.
If I just add a point on the nationalism, another great line of questions there. I think back to my experience in the UK and what happened when I was living there and I was growing up and what's happened subsequently. I would say attempts to run industrial policy as in, here's a sector under pressure, let's subsidize it, let's prevent its decline, or those generally didn't have very positive outcomes. However, the British have done really quite well on many advanced technology frontiers. I think that they need more funding, and they've obviously come under some various pressures, particularly currently. But I think that part of I think we need to somehow find a language, and maybe we don't quite have it yet. Picking the winners means this kind of subsidize the guys who are in trouble. We're talking about investing in new technology, trying to be at the forefront with those breakthroughs. And then what comes out of that is much more in the hands of the private sector in a competitive framework where they can create companies they can fail. So we mentioned Solyndra, we put that firmly on the table. Tesla, which a company you may or may not like, you may or may not think has lasting impact, certainly has changed the conversation around energy efficient cars, was also supported massively by Department of Energy at the very beginning with loan guarantees. So I think you want to make it, create potential for technology development and then let the market take over. If other countries are doing things that are massively unfair, that isn't a conversation that you're going to have. But I don't think it's a nationalist agenda, Jeremy. I don't think it was. I don't think it particularly. I think that's going to lead you down a mistaken path.
Okay, last question here.
Martin Trozempa, Peterson Institute. I wanted to ask you and push you a little bit on the validity of the historical example to the present moment. Probably familiar with the research came out, I think it was last year, the striking chart of the effective number of researchers we have working on science and then productivity. And the effective number of researchers has rocketed up and productivity has been pretty flat. So what makes you think that necessarily this time, with the potentially declining productivity of researchers, that we're actually going to get these big returns that you've been looking at?
Well, yeah, this is a very important paper by our colleague and friend John Van Reenen and Chad Jones at Berkeley, which shows that essentially the productivity, it's taking more scientists to discover new ideas. Well, that's willing to spend more, not less. That basically new ideas are what lead to growth. The fact that the productivity is declining, the sort of rate at which the research that catch to the frontier are rising, the same author, John Van Reenen, does another paper which says that he's sort of redoing an old paper which says the rates of return to R&D investment are still enormous, the social rates of return. It's just the ideas are harder to find, but once you find them, there's higher returns to finding them. So the fact that it's harder to find an idea doesn't mean that we shouldn't invest in it. It might mean we have to, if anything, invest more in it. And that basically what you really care about is ultimately what is that rate of return to the public rate of return to R&D. And Van Reenen's research work updates an older paper which says it continues to be on the order of 50%. That there's these enormous spillovers from R&D that mean that it's an incredibly productive investment, incredibly productive thing to be doing.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan Gruber, Simon Johnson, for sharing with us Jumpstarting America.
Thank you.
Thanks.